The following is a Salt and Light special presentation.
Hello and welcome to Salt and Light's live coverage of this historic moment in the life of the Church. It is Thursday, February 28th, and it is the final day of Pope Benedict XVI's papacy. Joining me on set for this day are Joe Sinizak, the publishing director of Novalis, and previous to that, publisher of the Catholic Register. So you've covered Benedict for many years. We're happy to have you here.
Good to be here.
And we have Chris Dimitrenko, a known face to Salt and Light viewers, one of our own producers. You've also covered Benedict extensively. So we're going to be going very shortly to live images from Rome. And I wanted to ask both of you, looking over the events of the past week, all of these lasts that we've seen, what has struck you and what have you seen? Is it in line with what we know of Benedict? Has he taken a departure in these last weeks? Joe, I'll give you the first word.
Well, I think it's in line with what we should know of Benedict. At times, I don't think it's the popular image of Benedict. But if you followed Benedict closely over the years, he actually has a very humble way of thinking about his role in history and his role as Pope. And so the very act that he has done of resigning, I think, is very much a part of who he is and how he sees his place in history. And so what we've seen over the last week, his response to the crowd yesterday at St. Peter's Square, was in keeping with who he is, really.
Chris, would you agree?
Well, I remember when I was in the Vatican back in, I think it was 2009, after a media firestorm had erupted after the lifting of the excommunication of the bishops from the Society of St. Pius X. And I remember looking up at the Apostolic Palace, wondering just how hard it was for him with all this criticism, with this very difficult job that he was experiencing. And yet, in the midst of all this, he certainly didn't solicit pity from anyone. He very rarely revealed the difficulties of the job, but this past week he did, and at the general audience I thought it was very candid, it was very moving, him acknowledging that it was like being St. Peter on the boat on the Sea of Galilee. There were moments of light and joy, but there were moments where the storms were very rough, and yet through it all he had trust in the Lord.
And this reminds me of something you were telling me just earlier, Joe, about how Benedict shows his closeness to people, or his emotion in small ways that perhaps the wider world misses because they're expecting a grander gesture.
Well, at heart, I still think he's an introvert. He's very much a kind of a shy academic, and I think he has a hard time showing his own emotions. But he responds almost as if he's surprised when he's treated with great affection and the kind of things we saw yesterday, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's almost endearing to see that happening, and it takes a lot to bring it out, but when it does, you see a little glimpse of the heart of the man.
Right, and we've seen that many times throughout the papacy. We saw that at Ground Zero, we saw that, I remember, in Mexico, and we saw again what you were saying, Chris, we saw that in 2010, when I was posted at the Vatican. I recall seeing something very similar with the situation in Ireland that was erupting, and it wasn't, please feel sorry for me and what I'm going through. It was small gestures, small gestures.
I did find really moving at the general audience that he acknowledged not just the people who had thanked him, who were officials. Of course, every head of state is going to write him a letter, and I suppose that's nice to receive, and you would expect him to be aware of those letters and to read them. But he spoke about how ordinary Catholics around the world had wrote him the letters, and he described the great affection in those letters. It was like letters from family members. And so that was, I thought, really beautiful how he took time to acknowledge those, because probably many of our viewers might have written him letters as well, and you don't know if he read them. Well, he certainly read some of them.
Yeah, that's right. I just want to take a moment to describe what we're seeing on camera. We're looking at a live feed from Vatican City. You're seeing the helicopter that will be taking Pope Benedict to Castel Gandolfo, where he will be spending the next 2 months, the interregnum and the period until his monastery is ready for him. This is the San Damasenso courtyard we're seeing now. What's going to happen in the next little while, Pope Benedict will come out of the Apostolic Palace. He will come into the San Damasenso courtyard, and we will see the staff of the papal household, the staff of that work in the various departments of the Apostolic Palace, gathered in this courtyard along with the Swiss guards, who will give one final formal salute to Pope Benedict. This is his moment to say goodbye to those who have worked most closely with him over the last few years. And from the courtyard, he will be driven to the heliport behind Vatican City, behind Vatican Gardens, and from there he will fly to Castel Gandolfo. We're looking at an overhead image of Vatican City, Castel Sant'Angelo, the famous castle that was built as a tomb for the Emperor Hadrian, and it's connected to the Vatican by the famous secret passage, Il Passetto. And I have now on the line Father Thomas Rosica, live from Rome.
Hello.
Hello, Father Thomas.
Alicia.
Can you describe for us what the mood is like today on the ground?
It's been rather extraordinary because we're really, there's a great sense of watching history in the making. These magnificent shots that you're seeing now, I presume, are from Vatican television. Lots of people in the square, lots of people in the street. I just came in the building and there's people praying. You see the courtyard here, the Apostolic Palace in the courtyard, and all of the Secretary of State staff has come downstairs. People on the balcony and the cupola now to watch the helicopter ride. There's a great sense of expectation. What was very surprising, I announced in the press conference this morning, about 3,700 journalists that are here from 800 different media outlets. So it's quite a remarkable scene and experience to be here.
Wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened today? We've heard about the meeting and we've seen images of the meeting with the Cardinals. Can you tell us more about that?
The meeting with the Cardinals was a rather private event. We were told that only Cardinal Sodano would bring words of greeting, but at the last minute the Pope handwrote his text. We received the text as the Pope was giving it, and it was a very touching text, especially at the end when he said, "I know my successors here in this group, and I pledge to you my reverence, respect, and obedience." And then he greeted personally 144 cardinals. We didn't know what they were saying to each other except watching the affection, obviously. Several of the cardinals were crying as they were sitting in the room as they were yesterday. And then the Pope had lunch. He went upstairs for the final moments of the Apostolic Palace, and we were just told he's just leaving the papal apartments now with the entourage of the 4 women living with him and Archbishop Ganswein. He'll be taking the elevator downstairs, the elevator right in the middle of the building we're seeing. And there'll be some greetings. No speeches are planned. He'll get in a car and then take the car over to the heliport. There's going to be one helicopter carrying the Pope and a second helicopter with a television crew inside that will be filming the 15-minute or so ride over to Castel Gandolfo. We see the entire corps of the Swiss guards that are here in the Apostolic Palace.
Father Rosica, I have to ask you, you have worked with Benedict, you've worked for Pope Benedict. What are you feeling in this moment as his pontificate draws to a close?
You know, it's very mixed emotions and mixed feelings, having been here now in the thick of things for 2 weeks almost. A feeling of wonderment and saying, wow, this is history in the making, 600 years and the retirement of a pope, resignation of a pope. A feeling of sadness. I got used to him and loved his teaching. At the same time, appreciated very much the burden that he bore and the suffering and also the fatigue that was very obvious these past months, but also profound gratitude. So there's no one particular feeling, mostly gratitude, though, for what, and the privilege of being here, knowing that the Vatican entrusted to Sebastian Gomes and to me a huge responsibility in dealing with the English-speaking press and media. And that's the biggest part of the media that's here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Father Rosica. I know you're busy. I'm going to let you go now, but thank you so much for joining us. And that was Father Thomas Rosica speaking to us live from the Vatican, where he is serving as the assistant to the director of the Holy See Press Office. We're looking at live images now of the San Damasenso courtyard, where Pope Benedict will very shortly arrive to greet those people who have worked most closely with him over the last 8 years, and the Swiss Guards will give him one final salute. Joe and Chris, Father Rosica spoke a little bit about the teaching, and that made me think of Benedict's legacy. What do each of you think his legacy will be? The resignation, I'm sure, is clearly above, at the top of the list as a giant teaching moment, but I'm sure you each have different opinions.
Well, there's a short-term legacy and a long-term legacy. I think the short-term legacy will be the fact that he seriously grappled with the issues that the Church is facing, particularly the clergy sex abuse crisis. He took that on as a huge burden and started the long, slow process of healing that the Church has been going through and will be going through over the next number of years. And I think that was a very courageous act. Secondly, however, I think you will have his teachings as a long-term legacy. And there weren't that many, but they're powerful. There are 3 major encyclicals, and probably for the larger mass of people around the world, his 3 books on Jesus of Nazareth displayed a dimension of the man that most people would not have been familiar with. And I think in the long term, that will be his legacy.
I would add to that the liturgy. For the English world, we all received a new translation of the Roman Missal. Of course, that was work that began before Pope Benedict, but in many ways I think it reflects the care and attention that he has shown to the liturgy. We saw at the beginning of his pontificate with his address to the Roman Curia in 2005 that he wanted to bring to the Church a proper understanding of Vatican II and the reforms, and particularly reforms with the liturgy, and seeing it in continuity. So not our hermeneutic of rupture, so to speak, but really seeing the Church's liturgy in continuity with what it's always been. And he again reflected upon this during his address to the priests of the Diocese of Rome, and that was just, I think, less than 2 weeks ago, not long after he announced that he would resign. And also in other ways, I mean, it might not affect most of us, but he opened up the use of the extraordinary form of the Mass. So that's something that is going to carry forward.
That's right. One of the things pointed to as Pope Benedict trying to show how the liturgy is a tradition and it continues, and we don't replace anything with something new. We continue with it. Joining me on the phone right now is Sebastian Gomes from Rome. He has been in Rome for the past 2 weeks. And Sebastian, hello, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Alicia, how are you?
Wonderful. Sebastian, what is it like right now? You are up close, you are seeing the action as it unfolds. Give us your impressions. Just what has this day been like?
Well, to be honest, it's been a little somber. I mean, yesterday was very exciting with the Pope's final general audience. I mean, we saw the flags waving, we saw the extended applauses, the shouts of joy and thanksgiving for the Pope from the different groups of pilgrims and nationalities from around the world. Today there is a little bit of a heaviness because the reality is set in that this is the last day. We see, the beautiful images, the ceremonial part of this. But there are still people around Rome. There's many people outside, in the square and surrounding the Vatican who have come to just, be a part of history. But I think there is a little bit of a heaviness as we see our spiritual leader depart us, and we see the images of him for the last time.
Now, Sebastian, you were following the audience with the Cardinals, the Pope Benedict's final meeting with the Cardinals this morning as it happened. Was there any part of either his speech or Cardinal Sodano's greetings, was there anything in particular in there that struck you?
Well, I was particularly struck by the humility of the Pope. It was a beautiful talk that he gave, most unexpected, because many of us thought, and even we were told officially, that the Pope wouldn't be speaking at that time. But he, acknowledged Cardinal Sodano's address, and then proceeded to basically share some last thoughts and emotions with his brother cardinals. Particularly in there, there was this one part where he offered a pledge of obedience to the new pope, whoever it would be. He said, one of you will take over from me, and I pledge my obedience to you and to the church. And it was a supreme act of humility as we move forward. But there was also this great consolation that he's not abandoning us, or he's not away from us in this time. He's still going to be with us in this profound reality of praying for the church and praying for the College of Cardinals these next weeks.
Now, Sebastian, I understand that last night there was a bit of an impromptu prayer vigil, an impromptu vigil in the piazza right underneath Pope Benedict's window. If you saw any of that, can you tell us a little bit about the mood there? And also, I'm curious, what are you seeing in terms of the reaction from the youth? In 2005, when we were in a papal transition, we were mourning a pope who was very much a pope for young people, and this is very definitely a different pope, very definitely an academic, an introvert, we've mentioned before. What are you seeing on the ground in terms of the reaction from youth?
Well, it's an excellent question. The support for Benedict has been very strong from the youth, and I think we have to put that question a little bit into perspective. You think about us, people who are our age, young adults, many of whom have been serious practitioners of the faith primarily in the years of Pope Benedict, and many of us might have been too young, to remember what our faith lives were like in the time of John Paul. Many of us remember it too, but for the most part, we've been shaped by this spiritual experience of having Benedict as our Pope. And I think some of the images of him before he was Pope as Cardinal, as the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, as a long-time, resident in Rome, had certain, personas, among Catholics that I don't think have translated onto the youth, the people who, young adults, people of our age. And I think many of them who are serious about the faith recognize that this is a very holy man, humble, peaceful, a man of profound faith. The decision, for example, to resign, you don't put that into. You wouldn't say that that's a very conservative decision. I mean, it hasn't been done in how many hundreds of years. So he's not afraid to do things new. He clearly is always appealing to the young energy that's alive in the church. We heard that yesterday at the general audience. And I think the youth that have come here have really, it's really been a profound testament to the way he connected with them specifically.
My last question to you, Sebastian, just very quickly, can you give us a bit of a heads up of what we should expect to see in the next little while, the next hour or so?
Well, the Pope is going to come out here. He'll take a short car ride over to the Heliport that's in the Vatican Gardens. And from there, he will greet Cardinal Sodano, I believe. Is it Cardinal Sodano or Cardinal Bertoni? And get into the helicopter and then take off for Castel Gandolfo. It's not going to be very long, period of images of him. But then, there's the people who are anxiously waiting for him at Castel Gandolfo too. He will land there, he will drive to the palace, and he will make his way out on the center balcony to give a blessing to the people who have gathered there and to say his final goodbye.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sebastian. We'll let you go to take in the rest of this historic day.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. One thing that we pointed out, that I mentioned there, was that in 2005 we had a very different papal transition going on. And that leads me to want to ask about the differences, not just, obviously at that point we were mourning a pope who had died, and here we are facing something that hasn't happened in 600 years. But because both of you have worked covering the papacy, covering the Vatican. What do you see, what differences do you see in the way that this transition is being covered both by Catholic media but also perhaps by secular media?
Well, I think to begin with, you had a papacy of some 26 years with a figure who was in many ways larger than life. Pope John Paul lived on this very large public stage and thrived on it, and it energized him. And he saw his life almost in cosmic terms, as his whole papacy as a symbol of the battle of the Church against evil and the proclamation of the Word to a whole new world. Benedict, as I said earlier, is a very different man, and saw himself, I think, in more humble terms, if I might put it that way. And by that, I don't mean any sort of criticism of John Paul. I think he was an amazing pope, as history will attest. But Benedict, I think, saw himself as a transitional figure, as someone to carry on the legacy of John Paul and perhaps cement that legacy, but not as having his own large agenda, his own large persona on this public stage. He preferred, as he said in his final words, to allow the bark of Peter to proceed and to allow Jesus to lead the way, and it's not his church, you know. Right. And I think that's very significant.
Right. Yes.
When John Paul II died, I wasn't working for Catholic media at the time. I was in campus ministry. But my whole life, I'd only known John Paul II. And so, to me, the papacy and John Paul II were really inseparable. And so, certainly for my generation, it was really very jarring for him to die. And to see a new pope come and take his place, I think that was also a very strange experience. But like Joe was saying, I think that we now see, I think partly because we've experienced more than one pope, for people who are my age, that the papacy is more than Pope Benedict. And in his words at the general audience, like you were saying, you know, it's the bark of Peter is not his, it's not ours. It belongs to Christ, it belongs to the Church. And so I think in some ways, some people were saying that his resignation demystifies the papacy. I would say you can look at it the other way. His resignation shows that the papacy is something grander than any one person.
Right. And on that note, we're going to listen now to John Thavis, the former Rome Bureau Chief of CNS. He spoke to the Catholic News Service Rome Bureau recently, actually just this past week, about his thoughts on this same topic. And we are going to hear now, correction, we are seeing the Holy Father now. We'll put John Thavis on hold for the moment. Pope Benedict is now leaving the papal apartments. We see him being greeted by the Cardinals, some of the Cardinals who live and work in the papal offices. Behind him is Archbishop Georg Ganswein. Members of the papal household bidding their farewell to Pope Benedict. We see a very emotional cardinal off to the side. We are witnessing some historical moments in the life of the Church. We are watching Pope Benedict leave the papal apartments in the Apostolic Palace at the Vatican for the last time. The Masters of Ceremony of the papal household leading the way. He is using his cane. Much to-do has been made about that cane in the past. I've heard actually many Vaticanists comment that actually sometimes it looks like he uses it more for decoration than anything.
When we all heard of the news of the resignation, I think that we all became very worried that maybe there was some impending health crisis, and so it's been certainly very relieving over these past few weeks to see him and to see him as himself and to see him at a lot of these public addresses seeming quite full of energy.
And Monsignor Georg Ratzinger, the Pope's older brother, actually told German reporters there is nothing specifically wrong with him. His answer was he's 86 years old. He's alive at an age when many people are not. Oh, and a chorus of applause greets the Holy Father as he walks out into the San Damasenso courtyard in the Apostolic Palace. Let's listen in. The Monsignors who work in the Secretariat of State giving their final greetings. Coming up next, we see Monsignor José Betancourt of Ottawa greeting the Holy Father for the last time. The staff of the Secretariat of State paying their farewells.
Lisa, much has been made of how it's been 600 years since a pope has resigned. And so we haven't seen these kinds of images of a pope leaving the Vatican. No, not in the internet age, not in the television age, not even in the age of photography. This is the first time we've ever been able to see any images like this.
And there's a new element to this. There's Twitter and Facebook and social media. And Chris, you're keeping an eye on social media. And we hear another loud round of applause for Pope Benedict and the staff who work in the papal household. A very emotional papal driver.
Through social media, a lot of people have been paying their tributes to Pope Benedict and expressing their gratitude for his service. Hopefully that those messages that people have been tweeting to Pontifex have been being relayed to him.
And SB1, the Pope's car, drives off to the heliport to take Pope Benedict to the flight, the helicopter that will take him to Castel Gandolfo. And the papal household bids farewell to Pope Benedict XVI for the last time. Now, while we're looking at these images, I'm curious the reaction from each of you. This has never been seen before, not in photos, not in historical accounts. The last pope to resign 600 years ago didn't leave any notes about what that was like. Mm-hmm. Joe, your reactions?
Well, it's so interesting to be part of history in this way, to see a pope actually resign for the first time in over 600 years and hop into a car and drive away. It's actually dumbfounding to think about it a bit. And yet, at the same time, it seems so natural. We're so used to it. It's so much a part of modern life. And I think that's the beauty of it, is he is expressing his humanity in a very real way. And I think the world will relate to this, and it'll touch everyone, because we all face this moment in our lives.
That's right. We just drove by the fountain that was commissioned by the Knights of Columbus, the fountain dedicated to St. Joseph. Off to the left, we see the Vatican Railroad, which is no longer used. The Governatorato building, this is the building that is essentially the Parliament for Vatican City. And the motorcade winds its way through the Vatican Gardens, up Vatican Hill to the Heliport, which is actually not very far from the Mater Ecclesia monastery where Pope Benedict will live once he returns from Castel Gandolfo. Now, Chris, I know that you are watching social media. What reaction are you getting? What are you seeing on Twitter and Facebook?
Well, Catholic bloggers all over the world have been expressing their gratitude and their thanks and their understanding of what he is doing. And we do invite all of our viewers as well through Twitter and Facebook to share your thoughts, and we will share those, some of your favorite memories of Pope Benedict, how you're feeling as the Pope is leaving. So if you go to our Facebook page, Salt and Light TV, or if you go to our Twitter account, that's at Salt and Light TV, you can tweet us and we'll share some of those messages as well.
And there was another unique initiative that I read about actually last night that I thought was quite interesting. The Youth Ministry Office in one of the Brazilian dioceses is encouraging all of the youth in their diocese to wear red shoes in union, to show their union with Pope Benedict. Of course, today is the last day that he will wear the iconic red shoes. And so the youth of Brazil are actually wearing red shoes today and sending their photos to this Youth Ministry Office. And the motorcade winds its way up to the Vatican Heliport. We're seeing the antennas for Vatican Radio in the shot.
The Pope did tweet today, and a tweet that went out at 11 o'clock Eastern said, "Thank you for your love and support. May you always experience the joy that comes from putting Christ at the center of your lives." So that, we expect, will be the last tweet of this pontificate. And the Twitter account at Pontifex will be going dark, so to speak, until the next Pope, and hopefully he will continue to use it.
Now, Pope Benedict has arrived at the Vatican Heliport, and what we will hear as the helicopter takes off and carries Pope Benedict away, all the church bells in Rome will begin to ring. Traditionally, this is done when the see becomes vacant, when a pontiff dies. Pope Benedict is very much alive and with us, and for that we are thankful, but he is leaving Vatican City, and we will hear the church bells of Rome ring in salute as he takes his leave. The Gendarmeria Vaticana, the Vatican police, saying their farewells to Pope Benedict. Archbishop Georg Ganswein, directing the Holy Father, pointing out some more well-wishers, some more Vatican well-wishers. There will be 2 helicopters taking off from this heliport. The first will be the helicopter carrying Pope Benedict and his personal secretary, Georg Ganswein. The second helicopter will be a helicopter with cameras in it. There are 27 RAI television cameras, RAI being the Italian state broadcaster. 27 cameras following Pope Benedict throughout these last few hours to catalog, to document these historic moments, and some of those cameras will be in the helicopter following Pope Benedict on the 15-minute flight to Castel Gandolfo, where he will reside during the interregnum.
I think it's quite remarkable that the Vatican Television Center has made this possible. 2 weeks ago, we didn't know what kind of images we would receive, if at all, if it would be rather private, just a few photographers, but they're really going all out so that the world can be a part of this, and I think it helps us.
And it's really been a surprise, day to day. Even this morning, we were not expecting Pope Benedict to actually give a speech.
That's right.
At the meeting with the Cardinals. Let's watch now this historic moment. Pope Benedict takes his leave of Vatican City. And as he does so, the church bells of Rome will begin to ring in salute to Pope Benedict XVI. The Italian police and the Vatican police inspecting, making sure he is safe. He will be accompanied by the Vatican police and a handful of Swiss guards to Castel Gandolfo. We see Cardinal Sodano and Cardinal Vallini watching as the helicopter takes off. The bells are starting to ring now in anticipation of Pope Benedict's departure. Let's listen in to the bells of Rome saluting Pope Benedict. In the background, the banner hanging off one of the buildings, Grazie, and the equivalent of thank you in German. The papal helicopter powers up and the bells of Rome begin to ring. Right behind the Vatican Gardens is the Minor Seminary of Rome, and we just saw in one of these shots, I'm sure we'll see it again, the seminarians there holding a banner off the edge of the building that reads Grazie, which is thank you in Italian, and the same phrase in German, in the Bavarian dialect of German. The last Vatican police officer boards the helicopter, and the papal helicopter is ready to take off. And there we see the Minor Seminary behind the Vatican Heliport, and the seminarians lined up to watch their bishop. We see a Canadian flag next to the Italian flag, and we have liftoff.
This is the last time the Pope will be at the Vatican for a number of months.
And when he returns, he will be Pope Emeritus. Flying out over the Gregorio VII neighborhood of Rome towards Castel Gandolfo. It is a 15-minute helicopter ride to Castel Gandolfo, and we see Romans out on their rooftops, out on their rooftop terraces, to catch a glimpse of the papal helicopter. And while we watch the Pope make his final journey as Pope, we're going to listen now to John Thavis, the former Rome Bureau Chief for Catholic News Service. He spoke to Catholic News Service earlier this week about Pope Benedict's resignation and how this compares to other moments in church history that he's covered.
It's been interesting walking around the old neighborhood around the Vatican, which is where Pope Benedict, as Cardinal Ratzinger, lived for 20-some years. And the people there have reacted in a couple of different ways. They're concerned for the Pope because they think, well, he must really be frail. They're concerned for his health. But most of all, they're wondering, are we going to see him again? You know, will he be walking through our streets feeding the cats ever again? Or is he going to disappear behind the Vatican walls? So it's a very strange kind of goodbye, and people don't quite know how to do it. Journalists are dealing with this idea of resignation for the first time as well. And of course, they have 1,000 questions. And the interesting thing is that the Vatican doesn't seem to have all the answers. You know, this is clearly a work in progress as far as the Vatican goes. Father Lombardi, the Vatican spokesman, has been extremely helpful, meeting with journalists every day, but he's been quite honest in saying he really doesn't know how everything's going to work out. And that's because I think Pope Benedict is going to define the job description of retired pontiff. For journalists, it's also the season of finding cardinals and trying to get them to talk about who might be the next pope. And I think the cardinals are, of course, always a little bit hesitant to start talking about that, but especially now because we have a reigning pope. We have a pope who's still in office. And it seems a little bit unseemly to be talking about that before he's even resigned.
And that was John Thavis, the former Rome Bureau Chief for Catholic News Service, talking about this unique moment in church history. You're watching live images of Pope Benedict XVI flying to Castel Gandolfo. He has left Vatican City, and he is going off to Castel Gandolfo, where he will live for the next 2 months. This is a historic moment. And I'm on set with Joe Sinizak, the publishing director of Novalis and former publisher of the Catholic Register, and Krista Mitrenko, our own producer here at Salt and Light. We've been looking back over Pope Benedict's papacy, over his pontificate, over what we know of the man, over this resignation, over his teachings.
Certainly taking the scenic route to Castel Gandolfo, flying right over Rome's Colosseum.
Absolutely, absolutely the scenic route. Joe, I wanted to ask you for your thoughts. What do you feel we should be focusing on at this moment as we try to look back over Benedict's papacy? There's so much.
Well, I think the big question for us is, where do we go from here? And this is not a question of who will be chosen as the next pope. This is a question for each of us. How do we take this papacy and make it our own and carry on with it? Because the church is more than just the pope and the cardinal and the bishops. The church is all of us. And certainly at Novalis, we've been talking about this for a couple years now, particularly with one aspect of his legacy, and that is the new evangelization.
Yes.
This is something that didn't originate with Benedict, but he has certainly made it a signature part of his papacy, and it is something for all of us, and it's something that we can try to discern our own role in speaking to the world an old message in many ways, but in a new way. And so as I watch the helicopter flying over Rome on its way to Castel Gandolfo, I ask myself, how can I, as a Catholic of too many years now, take this Pope's message and make it part of my life? And so for me, the new evangelization is something that just jumps out.
You mentioned Novalis, and you mentioned how you've been focusing on the new evangelization and discerning this. Do you have any ideas that you can share with us about where to go with that new evangelization? What do you think you can do in your role?
Well, for us, it's always about what kind of resources can we provide for Catholics today to help them to define who they are as Catholics against a world in which Christendom is no longer the predominant force. It's a very, very pluralistically religious world, but also a very secular world. In many ways, it's like the world of first-century Christians. And at Novalis, we've talked about the kinds of resources that plumb our traditions and bring out the richness of our traditions and speak them anew to people that really know next to nothing about our faith and about the story of the church and the story of Christ. And so we're trying to find out, well, we've started publishing various things over the last couple of years that are really quite simple and quite straightforward to help people know this message.
I think those are important questions for the church right now. I think that sometimes the media can tend to focus on, well, how do we get the young people engaged in the church? Maybe we need to change the church's teachings, or how do we fix the church? Maybe we need someone to go in and change the Roman Curia. And I think that those solutions are really missing the point of what needs to happen in the church. The Pope has been trying to engage young people, make them feel a part of the mission of the church. The church is trying to give resources for young people to be a part of the new evangelization.
Now, the Pope is flying over the outskirts of Rome, getting closer to Castel Gandolfo, and just before he arrives, we want to give you a preview of Castel Gandolfo, what it is, where it is, and the tradition that links Castel Gandolfo, the place, with the papacy. So we go now to a look at Castel Gandolfo, courtesy of Catholic News Service.
On the rim of a volcanic crater lake 15 miles southeast of Rome sits the papal villa at Castel Gandolfo, where Pope Benedict has been resting during this Easter week. The palace dates back to 1624 in the reign of Pope Urban VIII, who said he built it because it was beneath a pontiff's dignity to rely on other people's hospitality when he needed to escape the heat of Rome. When he's staying at Castel Gandolfo, Pope Benedict publicly prays the Angelus, or Regina Caeli, on Sundays and holds weekly public audiences on some Wednesday mornings. On those occasions, the courtyard of the palace and the town square beyond fill up with as many as 5,000 pilgrims.
And that was a look at Castel Gandolfo that Catholic News Service provided for us. That was actually a clip prepared over the last Easter week. Pope Benedict would traditionally spend time at Castel Gandolfo over the summer and the weeks after Easter. He's flying now. Pope Benedict is flying by helicopter over the suburbs of Rome, making his way to Castel Gandolfo. It is about a 15-minute flight. Essentially, the route he's taking is taking him not far from the Via Appia, the Appian Way, the ancient Appian Road, flying over Ciampino Airport, definitely along the route of the Via Appia. The Appian Way is also the place where there is a famous chapel called Quo Vadis, Dominus Quo Vadis, the place where it is reputed Saint Peter encountered the risen Lord who was walking towards Rome as Peter was walking away from Rome. And Peter asked the Lord, Domine Quo Vadis, where are you going? And Christ replied to him, I'm going to Rome to be crucified again. And so Peter too changed course and returned to Rome. It is a popular Roman legend that is a part of Roman identity. Pope Benedict's helicopter flying not far from the ancient Appian Way. At the moment, hovering over Ciampino Airport, just moments away from Castel Gandolfo. And we see the rolling Roman hills. It is just after 5 p.m. Rome time, early afternoon. The sun just beginning to make its descent. When Pope Benedict arrives in Castel Gandolfo, he will go to the Papal Palace there. We have word that people have been camping out in Castel Gandolfo since Friday to be among the crowd, to be part of the crowd that will see Pope Benedict for the last time. And so we do expect to see a large crowd waiting for him when he arrives at the Papal Palace. We know that he will step out onto the balcony where he normally recites the Angelus over the summer and give one final greeting to the faithful before he retreats from public life.
That story that you said about St. Peter leaving Rome and Jesus telling him to go back, Pope Benedict has clarified that he is not abandoning the cross, that he is not leaving his ministry, and he's not really, in effect, retiring. At the general audience, he spoke about how it's basically a new form of ministry. He feels that he can serve the church best through prayer, and that he understands that he has left his private life behind, and that's not something that he is ever going to take back. It's a commitment always and forever. And so we're not going to be seeing someone who is retiring in a way that we think of a politician who is retiring, who is going to be traveling and giving private conferences. But he seems to be taking this new phase of his ministry as seriously as the previous phase. It's just different.
Exactly, and that's something difficult, I think, for many people to understand, because we tend to think in an active way. We tend to think of support in an active mode. I just wanted to get back to something you mentioned a little bit earlier, Joe, about how this is really a moment to think about what now. Where does, where did the church go now? And you mentioned the new evangelization. Are there any other points that you think this is the opportune time to look at and discern, how do we deal with this? How do we move forward with this?
Well, I think the new evangelization goes hand in hand with another initiative of the Pope, particularly in the last year, but even, well, throughout his papacy, and that is the approach to the secular world, the dialogue with secularism, one aspect of which he's called the Court of the Gentiles. I think this is something that needs to carry on, and whomever is elected as Pope will have to carry on this, because the dialogue needs to continue. It needs to be deepened and broadened at the same time. This is the kind of thing you do here with Salt and Light. It's the kind of thing we do with Novalis, as well as speaking to the faithful. We're speaking to a broader world. So clearly this is going to be a high priority for the Church next month as well as the next few years.
You're right, there's no going back. The first meeting in Assisi of religious leaders, it was just different leaders representing different religious faiths. But the most recent Assisi meeting that Pope Benedict convened, there were also representatives of no particular faith, people who weren't believers. And so the Church understands that this is where we need to be engaging, because there's a large number of people who aren't Muslim, who aren't Christian, who aren't necessarily anything, but they're open to that conversation.
Okay. We're going to get back to this. I want to ask you both later about social media, the openness of the Vatican to new media. But before we do that, we've already looked at Castel Gandolfo. We know that after the Pope's 2 months in Castel Gandolfo, he will return to Vatican City and live in the Mater Ecclesia monastery. And earlier in the year, actually in October, during the Synod on the New Evangelization, our team was in Rome, and they visited the Vatican Gardens and they saw this monastery. So we are going to take now, we're going to give you an exclusive look into the Vatican Gardens.
The Vatican Gardens were built by Pope Nicholas III in 1279. The orchard, lawns, and gardens cover more than 50 acres. Atop Vatican Hill is a reconstruction of the Grotto of Our Lady of Lourdes. Built by Pope Leo XIII in a time when popes didn't travel, the statue and altar are the originals which stood in the place where Mary appeared to Bernadette in Lourdes in southern France. The Pope's devotion to the Blessed Mother heavily influenced Mariology in the 20th century. In 1992, Pope John Paul II opened a cloistered convent for nuns inside the Vatican, called Mater Ecclesiae. The Pope invites a different contemplative community every 5 years to pray for the Pope and for the Church. The most recent addition to the Vatican Gardens is the fountain dedicated to Saint Joseph, the patron of the Universal Church. It was built as a gift to the current Pope Benedict XVI in July of 2010, in honor of his baptismal name, Joseph. 6 bronze reliefs line the wall of the fountain, depicting the scenes of Joseph in the New Testament. The marriage of Mary and Joseph, the Annunciation to Joseph in the Gospel of Matthew, the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, the flight to Egypt.
And that That was a look at the Vatican Gardens where Pope Benedict will live after his period at Castel Gandolfo. We are looking now at live images of the papal helicopter. It has just landed in Castel Gandolfo, at the heliport in Castel Gandolfo. We will see Pope Benedict disembark from the helicopter and be taken by car to the papal palace. And there we expect to see him step out onto the main balcony of the palace, where he will give one final greeting to the faithful. And here he is. And we hear in the distance church bells ringing, just as we heard the church bells in the city of Rome ringing when the helicopter took off. The church bells in Castel Gandolfo are also ringing. He is greeted here, he will be greeted here by the Bishop of Albano, Albano being the region just outside of Rome, and several other local officials. Now, while we're watching this, we mentioned earlier that the last time a pope resigned, it was 600 years ago, if not more, depending on which pope you want to consider as the last pope to resign. There were no notes, there were no photos, there were no sketches, there was nothing left behind, and we just followed Pope Benedict's entire journey from Vatican City to Castel Gandolfo, and it will keep going. And that, I can't help but think of the initiatives that the Vatican has taken in the last year, especially opening a papal Twitter account, a revamped news website. And we were speaking earlier about the new evangelization and making Christ's message, helping the people of today understand Christ's message. But I wanted to ask, Joe, I know you have some thoughts on the Vatican's recent opening to social media, and I wanted to ask about that.
Well, let me put a different spin on it.
Okay.
The adoption of Twitter is just another step in a long tradition of embracing new media to proclaim the gospel. If you go back to the printing press, and even before that, of course, of art and stained glass windows and the printing press, the radio in the 20s and 30s. During the Second World War, Vatican radio was a huge force for getting the word out for peace and about the war. The Catholic press around the world in practically every language you can think of, the adoption of television, the adoption of the web, now Twitter. It has always been within their tradition to find new ways to proclaim the gospel. I wouldn't say they're early adopters by any means, but when they see something having success, they are willing to see how it can be used.
Yeah. And I think that points to another thing that we often forget, is that it can be used.
That's right.
There is nothing about social media, there is nothing about television when it first came out that is intrinsically against our faith. It all depends on how we use it and what we do with it. Chris, you are an avid tweeter and
Yes.
Facebooker. Your thoughts on the Pope having his own Twitter feed at Pontifex?
Well, for most of us, it's a fairly natural thing to go onto Twitter or onto Facebook. It's something that, if we use computers all the time and we're engaged in social media, we're very eager to jump into these things. But for the Pope, we know that using the computer is not something that he necessarily does on a regular basis. I believe that he likes to handwrite his documents, but yet he decided to jump into this new realm because he understood that it was maybe not so important for him personally as part of his day-to-day life, but for many people this is part of their existence. And I'm at his Twitter account right now at Pontifex. Right now there's about 1,600,000 followers who will have received his last tweet, which was, "Thank you for your love and support. May you always experience the joy that comes from putting Christ at the center of your lives." And so that was sent at 11 a.m. Eastern, and so very just before the Pope actually left. And millions more people who are following him in other languages, including Latin. And so the Pope has really understood that this is something that the Church needs to dive into, even if some of its older members who are maybe less comfortable with it on a personal level, this isn't something that they might do day to day. But for younger generations, it's integral. And so I think that if whoever becomes Pope next, I think it would be very, very disappointing if he didn't follow Benedict's lead. That's
right. Now, for those of you watching us, we are looking at live images of Pope Benedict driving through the Papal Farms at Castel Gandolfo. He has just landed a few moments ago by helicopter in Castel Gandolfo, and is now being escorted by car from the heliport to the Papal Palace. And these are the Papal Farms, the mythical Papal Farms that many people have heard of but have never seen. We are getting now a very rare look at the Papal Farms that supply food and vegetables, we've been told even milk, to the papal household.
You're right. This is a perspective that I certainly haven't seen before. We're used to seeing the Pope at Castel Gandolfo in the summertime. It's his summer residence. And so for the Angelus, he will greet pilgrims who come there to pray the Angelus with him. But we never get this aerial perspective. It's not a bad place to retire.
That's a perfect place. It's a perfect place to retire. What a historic moment. And momentarily, we will see Pope Benedict appear on the balcony over the courtyard of the Papal Palace. And we expect him to give his final greeting. We don't know if it will be a full speech or a simple step out onto the balcony and a wave to the crowd. We know that people have been waiting since Friday to see Pope Benedict. People have been camping in Castel Gandolfo since Friday to be part of this moment. And I did want to share with you all reactions that we've gathered from various bishops around the world, Canadian bishops and other bishops around the world, but I think we're going to follow the Holy Father. We're going to follow the Holy Father through the Palace of Castel Gandolfo, and he will be appearing shortly on the balcony. We see in the courtyard already the crowd waiting for his final appearance. Now he's not going to appear in the inner courtyard. We see an inner courtyard in the square building where he recites the Angelus. That will not be where he's making his appearance. He will be appearing on the outer balcony, which is actually a piazza, in the town of Castel Gandolfo, in front of the Papal Palace. Vatican flags are waving. People are filling the streets of this small town. Now, I've been there myself. It is a small space. It's definitely not as wide as St. Peter's. But oh my, they filled every nook and cranny.
It's important to note that this is one of the last moments that potentially we will be seeing Pope Benedict. We don't know what kind of public events that he will be going to, if any at all, following his retirement.
Balcony is ready. Joe, your thoughts as you watch these scenes?
Well, Chris has made a good point. I really don't want to miss this. This is a special moment for all of us.
We know that the doors of this residence will be closed at between 7:50 and 8:10, and the Swiss guards will be leaving since they're no longer going to be protecting the Pope, and that's their principal responsibility.
We're actually looking right now at Lake Castel Gandolfo. The town is a two-part town, so the Papal Palace is on the upper part of the town, overlooking the lake, and the rest of the town is on the lower part along the lake shore. And Pope Benedict will arrive momentarily. As you mentioned, Chris, that's right, the interregnum, sede vacante, the period in which we officially do not have a pope, begins at 8 p.m. Rome time The Swiss guards protect the Pope himself. So at 8 p.m. Rome time, the Swiss guards will go into the palace and close the doors, which symbolizes that there is no Pope present here.
We have received word that the Vatican Television Center will be broadcasting that, and so we will be airing this on Salt and Light Television, but we won't be seeing the Pope. So this is really the last time.
That's right. That's right. And the Pope has already sent out his last tweet, as you mentioned, Chris, at Pontifex, tweeted, "Thank you for your love and support. May you always experience the joy that comes from putting Christ at the center of your lives." If you're just joining us, you are watching live images from Castel Gandolfo, where Pope Benedict will make his final public appearance in a few short moments to greet the faithful who are gathered here for this once in 600 years moment. We hear the crowd chanting Benedetto, his name in Italian, as we've heard crowds chant so many times on his different apostolic voyages and public appearances. A fabulous view, beautiful view of the town of Castel Gandolfo on the shores of Lake Castel Gandolfo, one of the 7 hill towns of Rome, the Castelli Romani, the Roman castles, linked to ancient Roman history. The sign we're looking at says, "Your humility has made you even greater. Thank you, Pope Benedict." A sign in Italian from parishioners from a church in Albano, Albano being the neighboring town.
It's interesting how that humility is being recognized everywhere by the crowd. It's been commented on by many of the Vaticanistas and others around the world. It certainly marked his whole papacy. In 2008, at Ground Zero, he met with victims and their relatives from 911.
Yes.
And he spent a lot of time just listening to them and praying with them. And so he was not the focus of attention, they were. And to me, that struck me as a true symbol of what this Pope is like.
That's right. And we saw the same thing on several of his voyages. He met with survivors of clerical sexual abuse, but they reported the same thing, that he was listening to their story. Pope Benedict is in the papal apartments at Castel Gandolfo, making his way to the outer balcony of the palace, where he will give his final blessing and greeting to the faithful gathered below. And a cheer goes up. Let's listen in. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. There's no prepared speech here, so anything he says will be his own remarks from the heart, unscripted.
Cari amici,
dear friends,
sono felice di essere con voi.
I am happy to be with you,
Circondato dalla bellezza del
surrounded by the
creato, e dalla vostra
beauty of
simpatia
this
che mi
place
fa molto bene. Grazie
and your
per la vostra
friendship.
amicizia,
It does me so
il vostro
well.
affetto.
I thank you for your friendship and your affection.
Voi sapete che questo giorno mio è diverso da quelli
You know that this
precedenti.
day is different from all previous
Non sono
days.
più Pontefice sommo della Chiesa
I
Cattolica,
am no
fino
longer
alle 8 di sera
Pontifex
sono ancora poi non più.
As of 8 p.m. tonight, I'm simply a pilgrim who begins the final stage of his earthly pilgrimage.
I
will be close to you all. You will be in my heart. I love you. You must all work for the greater good of the Church and humanity. Let us walk together. Let us walk forward together for the greater good of the Church and the world. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, I give you my blessing. Good night. Thank you and good night. And there we have it. Pope Benedict has given his final greeting to the pilgrims below and his final apostolic blessing. And we're going to stay on these images of the pilgrims. I just want to get final thoughts from each of you on this historic moment and those words and what we've seen.
Well, those words, I think, will stay with me for a long, long time. Just the expression of simple friendship, of the recognition that he's a pilgrim with us as we journey forward, and that blessing. Those things, well, they'll stay, as I said, they'll be in my heart and in my memory for a while.
Having covered the Pope for the past 6 years, I'm so used to hearing that blessing and hearing him say it, and with that German accent that he has. And so it's that voice that I'm going to be missing so much. And when he retreated back through the window, yeah, there's certainly a sadness that comes from that. But at the same time, I'm very thankful that both he and the Vatican has made sure that we're able to say goodbye. And when we heard that the resignation would be happening in a number of weeks, I was initially thinking that's not really enough time. I would have imagined that he would say, you know, well, I'm going to be retiring in maybe 6 months if he was going to do something like that. And yet with his speeches, with this broadcast that we saw today, in which we were able to follow the Holy Father as he left the Vatican, as he got in his helicopter and arrived here and gave his final blessing, it all felt very appropriate.
Yes, and you know that if Benedict announced, I will be retiring at the end of the month, you realize that he was thinking about this months and months before. And in fact, his brother did tell German reporters, he actually told, Georg Ratzinger said, well, he told me over the summer that he had decided he was going to do this. So very well thought out, very carefully thought out and weighed decision. But Chris, like you, I've covered many, many Vatican events, and I've heard that blessing many times, but there was a difference with this one. It wasn't the usual papal blessing in Latin, Pax Vobis. It was the blessing that many parish pastors in Italy give their parishioners. May God Almighty be with you. Blessed be God, the Almighty, forever. So definitely a poignant moment, a historic moment. And we're looking now over Castel Gandolfo, the place where Pope Benedict will live for the next 2 months, while the Mater Ecclesia convent is restored and prepared for him. Now, the pontificate is not officially over. Pope Benedict is Pope until 8 p.m. this evening in Rome, so in just a couple of hours. And we will be bringing you at that moment live when the Swiss Guards retreat and close the doors of Castel Gandolfo. Now, on the phone from Rome is Sebastian Gomes to give us an update on what's been happening. Sebastian, thank you very much for joining us again.
Yes, no problem.
Sebastian, we've all just watched some historic moments unfold before our eyes, some very emotional moments, I think, for everyone involved. Can you give us a sense? I know that you are in Rome, you're at St. Peter's. Having lived in Rome during some moments like this, I know that the mood, the atmosphere in Rome is palpable and it changes very quickly. Can you give us a sense of what the feeling is right now?
Yes, I can, Lisa. Very sad. This is a way of saying goodbye that every Catholic is not used to. We usually have, a funeral, and that's a different way of grieving a loss. This was very unique, but I think a lot of the same feelings are there. There's a lot of people that are very emotional, not only in the square, watching all of this unfold on the screens in St. Peter's, but also in the press hall with people that we've been working with these last couple of weeks. It's just very touching. There's an emptiness right now.
Sebastian, you mentioned the press hall, and I want to ask you about that. I know many of the people who are there right now in the press hall have been covering the Vatican for years, for longer than some of us at Salt and Light have been alive, if we want to put it that way. But their whole life is the Pope and the Vatican and covering that and knowing the intricacies of the papacy inside and out. What is the reaction among those people? What is the reaction among the press corps who, they have to remain objective, but at the end of the day, they still develop ties? What is the sensation there?
Well, that's a very interesting point, Alicia, because when we think about the media, especially when something like this happens and the international media descends on Vatican City, to capture all of this history in the making, as you said, stories come out, and the media sometimes tends to portray stories in a very superficial way. And I know from my experience dealing with people here in the press office, that those people that you're speaking about, the people who have dedicated their lives, their journalistic lives, to covering what happens in the Vatican and to cover the life of the Pope and the doings of the Pope, the travelings of the Pope, take it very seriously, and it's a part of who they are. And this is a very difficult transition for them, I can tell you. Having talked to them over the course of the day, it's difficult. It's difficult. They have to say goodbye in a way that they're not used to, yes. And at the same time, they have to try to tell the story. But I think we can all be sure that this story will not be told without the human emotion that will be a part of this story forever.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sebastian. I know this is an overwhelming moment for everyone, including yourself. So I will let you go now, and from everyone here, thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. God bless.
And what we're looking at right now is a live shot of St. Peter's Square, where the crowd that was gathered here has dispersed, and we're looking at the empty papal apartments. We're going to come back to the studio shortly and just get your final thoughts before we wrap up and leave our viewers with a special biography of Pope Benedict and his papacy. You've both covered the Pope. You've both read his works. You've both just witnessed these historic images. Final thoughts from each of you.
Well, I mean, for me it is very emotional, and just following some of the reactions online on my phone as this broadcast has been going on, I'm just getting a sense of what this means for the whole church, and the whole church has kind of stopped for this moment. We had one of our Facebook viewers say, "Holy Father, we love you. I'm going to miss you. Thanks for the opportunity to meet with you." I had another person say, "I'm bawling." And another person say, "I'm watching this in the middle of my psychology class." So online, through saltandlighttv.org, people around the world have been watching this. And I think we're all feeling the same thing right now. It's a sense of of deep gratitude for what the Holy Father has done, and yet a sense of excitement going forward into this unprecedented moment in history.
Yes. Joe?
Well, I'm going to reveal my age a little bit by saying this, but I've now lived through 5 popes. Wow. Wow, he says. Yes, wow. And that's a lot of history. I mean, we have had the Second Vatican Council, we had the epic papacy of John Paul II, and now this history-making decision by Benedict to resign. This says we are in a new world. And to me, in a way, it's a sign of hope. It's a sign of hope for the Church, that we are still guided by the Spirit, and that we will be carrying on as best we can. I recall during the Second World War, of course, they always said, keep calm and carry on.
Yes.
Well, those words struck me this morning as I was on my way here, is what do we do now? We keep calm and we carry on. Mm-hmm. But we carry on in hope, and we carry on in prayer. And I know this Pope will be praying for us. And I think that's a takeaway for me that will stick with me for a while.
One very last question for you, because the Pope's writings, that's your business. You're in the business of books.
That's right.
If there is one of Benedict's recent, or perhaps not so recent, either books or essays or writings that you would recommend people read, what would it be?
If I were to say just Catholics, I would talk about his encyclicals. But speaking to the whole world, I would say read his 3 books on Jesus of Nazareth. It is an introduction to Jesus that is, I think, really helps to create a relationship with Jesus, or helps to spark a relationship with Jesus. He writes very, very well. It's a very accessible language, and I would recommend starting with the first one and working your way through.
Okay, and I think that would be a really fitting way to celebrate his pontificate, if everyone read those 3 books.
Exactly.
Wonderful. I want to thank you both for being with me during this historic moment. And I want to thank our viewers for being with us for that. Now, this is not the end of our coverage today. As we mentioned, Sede Vacante officially begins at 8 p.m. Rome time. That's about 2 hours from now, and Salt and Light will bring you coverage of that. Stay tuned for that. We will bring you the moment when Pope Benedict's pontificate officially ends. From everyone here, I want to thank you all for watching. Now we're leaving you with a special look at the life and papacy of Pope Benedict XVI, the professor-made Pope. Thank you for watching, and we will see you later today.